Mark wiped the sweat off his forehead, the scent of freshly cut wood filling the air as he carefully sanded down the kitchen cabinets. The house was finally coming together after months of work. He had poured his heart and soul into every nail, every plank, believing that he was building not just a home, but a future with Julia. He smiled to himself, imagining the moment they would finally sit down together in this kitchen, drinking coffee on a quiet Sunday morning, feeling content in the life they had built. But fate had other plans. As he reached for another tool, a voice floated from the living room. It was Julia's. At first, it was just background noise, the familiar cadence of her voice mixing with the occasional clinking of ice in her glass. But then, something in her tone changed. Light, almost playful, but carrying an edge that made Mark pause. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something told him he needed to listen. Of course, he has no idea. Julia's voice was laced with amusement. Mark still thinks we're the perfect couple. God, he's so oblivious. Mark's grip on the screwdriver tightened. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic thud echoing louder than the sound of his own breathing. You know how long I've been planning this, she continued. I just need a little more time. Once the promotion is finalized, I'm out. He won't see it coming. A sickening wave of realization washed over him. This isn't real. This can't be real. The woman he had devoted his life to, the woman he had vowed to cherish, was speaking about him like he was nothing more than a stepping stone. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. A nervous laugh from the other end of the call. Julia took a sip of her drink before continuing. No, I'm not worried. He's so busy with his damn workshop, always lost in his little projects. He barely notices when I'm home, let alone what I'm up to. She let out a soft chuckle. I've already started moving things out, little by little. He hasn't even realized. Mark's stomach twisted. Moving things out. His mind flicked back to the small, missing items he had chalked up to misplacement. A few expensive handbags, some jewelry, even a couple of important documents. He had ignored it, thinking nothing of it. Now, the pieces fell into place, forming a picture that made him sick. And the bank accounts? The voice on the phone asked. Oh, don't worry, Julia assured. I've been careful, just taking small amounts here and there. When the time comes, I'll take what's rightfully mine. A cold, hollow emptiness spread through Mark's chest. She was talking about their shared savings, the money they had worked for together. But to Julia, it was nothing more than an asset to be liquidated before she walked away. Mark forced himself to breathe. Stay calm. Don't react. Not yet. If she had been playing a game this whole time, then he needed to play smarter. He couldn't let her know that he had heard. Not until he decided what to do next. Through the crack in the kitchen doorway, he caught a glimpse of her. Julia sat curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, completely at ease. She twirled a strand of hair between her fingers, her lips curved into a satisfied smile. She wasn't the woman he had married. Or maybe she never was. The weight of the betrayal settled over him like a crushing force, but along with it came something else, a slow-burning fury, simmering beneath the surface. He had built this life with her, sacrificed for her, and in return, she had orchestrated his downfall behind his back. Mark's gaze drifted to the tools laid out before him on the counter. His hands, rough from years of working with wood, curled into fists. He had spent so much time crafting this house into something beautiful, believing it was a foundation for love. But now, as he stood in the half-finished kitchen, listening to the woman he had once trusted plot against him, he realized the truth. This wasn't a home. It was a battleground. And he wasn't going down without a fight. Mark took a deep breath, forcing his hands to remain steady as he continued sanding the wooden frame in front of him. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his face remained impassive. He couldn't let Julia suspect a thing. Not yet. Not until he had everything he needed to turn the tables on her. For the next few days, he played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. He kissed Julia goodbye in the mornings, prepared dinner when she worked late, and even smiled when she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone, oblivious to his burning gaze. But behind the facade, Mark was watching, calculating. Late at night, when Julia was fast asleep, Mark took his first real step toward uncovering the full extent of her betrayal. He sat at his desk, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his face, and accessed their joint bank account. His breath hitched when he saw the transactions. Large sums of money transferred out in small, strategic amounts. She was siphoning their savings, one piece at a time. Mark clenched his jaw and took screenshots of everything. Dates, amounts, recipient details, each piece of evidence meticulously documented. His hands trembled with rage, but he forced himself to remain logical. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control him. He needed more. The next day, Mark took a detour before heading to work. He stopped by his old friend James' house. James had been his best man at the wedding, a loyal friend through the years. More importantly, James was a divorce attorney. "Mark, what's going on?" James asked, concern etched across his face as he led him inside. Mark hesitated for a second before exhaling heavily. "Julia's been planning to leave me. She's draining our accounts, moving things behind my back. I overheard her on the phone. She's been setting this up for months." James' face darkened. "You have proof?" Mark nodded, pulling out his phone and showing James the screenshots. "Bank statements. Transfers. I still need more, though. Something concrete. I think she's talking to a lawyer about the divorce already." James studied the screen, his expression unreadable. "If she's planning to take your money and leave, you need to act fast. Do you have access to her messages?" Mark shook his head. "Not yet, but I can get them." James leaned forward. "Then do it. The moment she files for divorce, she'll try to paint you as the bad guy. You need to be 10 steps ahead." Mark left James' house with a new sense of purpose. That night, he lay in bed, his mind racing as Julia slept beside him. He had to find a way into her phone. An opportunity came sooner than he expected. The next evening, Julia was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mark moved swiftly, picking it up with steady hands. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "We should meet soon. Need to finalize the paperwork." Mark's stomach twisted. His fingers moved on their own, opening the chat. What he found made his blood run cold. Dozens of messages between Julia and a lawyer discussing divorce settlements, asset division, and how she planned to argue for a larger share of the money. She wanted him ruined. Mark didn't hesitate. He took pictures of everything, forwarding them to his own email. Then, he carefully placed the phone back, his heart hammering in his chest. He exhaled shakily, a grim determination settling over him. He would not be blindsided. The next morning, he met with James again. This time, he had everything he needed. James skimmed through the messages, nodding. "This is exactly what we needed. Now, here's what you're going to do." As James outlined the next steps, Mark felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about protecting his assets anymore. This was war. Julia thought she could manipulate him, strip him of everything, and walk away unscathed. But she had underestimated him. Not for much longer. Mark knew he couldn't act impulsively. If he confronted Julia now, she'd twist the story in her favor, playing the victim, making him the villain. No, he had to be smarter than that. He had to build an airtight case against her, something undeniable, something she couldn't manipulate. And so he continued to play the part of the clueless, loving husband while working methodically in the background, crafting his perfect trap. Every morning, he worked on the house as if nothing had changed. The rhythmic sound of his hammer and saw masked the storm brewing inside him. While Julia believed he was just finishing renovations, he was actually constructing a hidden compartment within the walls of their bedroom closet, his own little vault, where he could store the damning evidence he had been gathering. Bank statements, text message screenshots, call logs, even the recordings of her conversations. Everything was meticulously organized and locked away, a time bomb waiting to go off at the right moment. But that wasn't enough. Mark needed a failsafe in case things spiraled out of control. He sat at his workbench one night, under the dim glow of his desk lamp, and began writing. "To whoever finds this letter. If you are reading this, then things have gone south. Inside the hidden compartment in our bedroom, you'll find evidence of Julia's deceit. She planned this from the start, using me, draining our accounts, and plotting her escape while ensuring she takes as much as she can. I have proof. I have it all. If anything happens to me, let this letter be the truth that I may no longer be able to tell." Mark paused, staring at the words he had just written. A deep breath filled his lungs before he exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into a sealed envelope before adding it to the hidden compartment. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Julia had been planning her escape for months, maybe even years. If she sensed that he knew, who was to say she wouldn't do something drastic? Mark refused to be caught off guard. His next step was even riskier. He needed concrete evidence that Julia wasn't just talking about leaving. He needed to hear her say it in her own words. So he set up a small digital recorder, concealed in a book on their bedside table, and waited. The first few nights, there was nothing. Julia would scroll through her phone, sip her wine, and eventually fall asleep. Mark kept his patience. Then, finally, it happened. Late one evening, Julia walked into their bedroom, phone pressed to her ear. Mark, pretending to be asleep, listened carefully as she whispered, "Yes, everything is in place. The money transfer is almost complete." A pause, then a soft, cruel laugh. "He has no idea. I can't believe it's taken this long, but it's finally happening. Just a few more weeks, and I'll be out of here, with a nice little bonus from the settlement." Mark clenched his fists beneath the covers, but he stayed perfectly still. He had what he needed. The next morning, he retrieved the recorder and played back the conversation, making sure the quality was clear. Her words were crisp, undeniable. It was all falling into place. Just when he thought he had enough, Julia made a crucial mistake. She left her laptop open while taking a shower. Mark hesitated at first. He wasn't the kind of man to snoop. But this wasn't about trust anymore. He needed to know everything. As he scrolled through her emails, his heart pounded in his chest. There it was, correspondence with her lawyer. Subject line, finalizing divorce and financial assets. Mark took out his phone and snapped a picture of the screen. He had all the evidence he needed. Now, it was just a matter of time before he sprung the trap. With everything in place, he took one last precaution. He sent an encrypted email to his best friend, James, attaching copies of all the evidence. If something unexpected happened, James would know exactly what to do. Mark put his phone down and exhaled. The game wasn't over yet, but the pieces were set. The only thing left to do was wait for the perfect moment to strike. The night of the party was a spectacle. Julia had gone all out, ensuring every detail was impeccable. The house, freshly renovated by Mark's own hands, gleamed under the soft glow of elegant chandeliers. The scent of gourmet appetizers filled the air as friends, colleagues, and family members laughed and chatted, raising their glasses in celebration. Julia wore a radiant smile, playing the perfect hostess, soaking in the admiration of those around her. Mark stood in the background, watching. He had played his part well, feigning oblivion, masking his emotions under a composed exterior. But beneath the surface, his heart pounded. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully orchestrating every detail. Tonight, the truth would come out. As Julia toasted to their beautiful home and the incredible support of her wonderful husband, Mark felt the bile rise in his throat. He clenched his jaw, waiting for the perfect moment. The guests clapped, raising their glasses, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Then, just as Julia began another charming anecdote about their happy life together, Mark pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the play button. The room filled with Julia's voice. But this wasn't the sweet, affectionate Julia they all knew. This was the Julia who had spoken in hushed, calculating tones to her friend on the phone. "I don't love him. I never did. Mark was just convenient. He gave me stability, a house, and now that my promotion is coming through, I'll finally be able to leave him. I've already started moving money. He won't even see it coming." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the room. Glasses were frozen midair, forks paused halfway to mouths. The guests exchanged stunned glances, disbelief evident in their wide eyes. Julia's face drained of color. Her breath hitched as she frantically looked around the room, searching for a way out, a way to explain. But there was no explanation that could undo what had just been heard. "Mark," she gasped, her voice trembling. I don't know what this is, but it's not real. This has to be some kind of sick joke." Mark tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "A joke?" He let out a humorless chuckle. "You mean like the joke you played on our marriage? Like the joke where you planned to rob me blind and walk away as if I was nothing?" Julia's eyes darted across the room, searching for support, but all she found were stunned expressions, judgmental stares, and whispers of betrayal. Even her closest friends, the ones she had so carefully curated, looked at her with doubt. "Please," she tried again, her voice weaker now. "You have to believe me. He must have doctored that audio." Mark shook his head. "Oh, don't worry, Julia. That was just one clip. I have plenty more. In fact, Let's hear the one where you discuss with your lawyer how you plan to take half of everything I own. He tapped his phone again. Another recording played. More damning evidence. More cold, undeniable proof. Julia's carefully constructed world crumbled in an instant. The whispers turned to outright gasps. Her own family, her parents who had adored Mark, looked at her in horror. Her father, a man who had always prided himself on integrity, took a step back as if she were a stranger. No, she whispered, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. No, this isn't happening. Oh, but it is, Mark said, his voice calm, almost eerily so. He turned to the guests, lifting his glass. To Julia, the most cunning, deceitful woman I've ever known. He took a slow sip, letting the moment sink in. Julia staggered, gripping the edge of the table for support. Mark, please, she pleaded now, desperation creeping into her voice. We can talk about this. We can fix this. Fix this. Mark laughed, shaking his head. Julia, you broke this the moment you decided I was just a stepping stone. The room had become unbearable for her. Eyes bore into her like daggers, and the weight of her exposed betrayal pressed down on her like a collapsing building. She turned, as if to flee, but where could she go? There was no escape from the truth. The walls were closing in. Mark let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest finally easing. He had waited for this moment, prepared for every possible reaction. And now, as he watched Julia crumble under the weight of her own deceit, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: freedom. The party was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The room was heavy with silence, thick as the tension that crackled between Mark and Julia. Her face was a mask of desperation, her carefully curated persona crumbling in front of the people she had tried so hard to deceive. The guests, once enjoying their drinks and laughter, were now frozen in place, their gazes locked on the unraveling disaster before them. Mark took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, controlled. He had waited for this moment, not out of malice, but out of necessity. He needed Julia to understand that her betrayal had consequences. You think I didn't see this coming? Mark's voice was steady, cold. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With the push of a button, a new recording played, but this one wasn't just Julia plotting her escape. No, this was worse. The voices were unmistakable. Julia's soft, almost sultry tone mixed with another man's voice, one that wasn't Mark's. Words laced with affection, with deceit, filled the air. The confession of an affair, whispered promises, and worst of all, the mocking way she spoke about her husband. About how easy it was to manipulate him, how he was nothing more than a stepping stone. The impact was immediate. Gasps echoed through the room, and Julia staggered back, her lips parting as though she wanted to protest, but had no words left to defend herself. A few of her so-called friends exchanged knowing glances, some with pity, others with disgust. Mark continued, his tone unwavering. I went through our accounts, Julia. I know about the money you were funneling away, the secret transfers, the hidden apartment lease. I even know about the conversations you had with your lawyer, planning to leave me high and dry once you secured your promotion. Julia shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek, but Mark wasn't moved. Not anymore. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark, save it, he cut her off. I let you play your game, let you think you were getting away with it. But you made one mistake. You underestimated me. Her breathing was erratic now, panic setting in. You can't do this to me, she pleaded, stepping forward. I'll lose everything. Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. You already have. Another guest, a colleague of Julia's, finally spoke up. Julia, is this true? His voice carried the weight of disappointment, and Julia could only stare at him, speechless. She turned back to Mark, eyes wide with fear. Please, she tried again, we can fix this. You don't have to do this. Mark exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? This was never about me destroying you. You did that yourself. I just made sure everyone else saw the truth. Julia's hands trembled as she clutched at the table, seeking stability where there was none. Her world was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her betrayal was no longer a secret, her reputation in shambles. The people she had once relied on for validation now looked at her with disdain. The divorce papers are ready, Mark said, sliding a thick envelope onto the table. You won't get a penny from me. Not after what you've done. Julia blinked rapidly, as if hoping this was all some terrible nightmare. Mark, but there was no sympathy left in his eyes. Goodbye, Julia. And with that, he turned, walking away from the wreckage she had created. The guests whispered amongst themselves, the weight of the revelation settling in. Julia stood motionless, the realization crashing down on her. She had played the game, but Mark had won. Mark stood in the middle of the house, now eerily silent after the chaos of the past few weeks. His suitcase sat by the door, packed with only the essentials. He had built this home with his own hands, poured his love and effort into every wooden beam, every carefully crafted detail. And yet, it no longer felt like home. It had become a battlefield, a place tainted by betrayal and deceit. Julia sat on the couch, her face pale, eyes swollen from the tears she had shed over the past few days. She had lost everything. Her carefully constructed lies had crumbled, leaving her exposed. No more deception, no more manipulation, just the cold, hard reality of her actions staring her in the face. So that's it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark took a deep breath, his expression unreadable. That's it. You wanted a way out, Julia. Congratulations. You got it. She shook her head, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress as if she were trying to anchor herself in the present. I never wanted this. Mark let out a quiet, bitter laugh. No? You wanted my money, my trust, my love, but not me. Her lips trembled, but she had no argument left to give. He had the evidence, the messages, the recordings. The betrayal was undeniable. And now, as she sat there in the ruins of her carefully laid plans, the weight of her actions finally seemed to crush her. He grabbed his suitcase and walked toward the door, pausing for a moment. You know, Julia, there was a time I would have done anything for you, given you everything. She looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes for just a second. But his next words snuffed it out like a dying flame. But that man is gone, and I have nothing left for you. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp evening air. It was freeing, in a way. A new chapter, one that no longer included Julia. Weeks passed. Mark had moved on, found peace in a quiet rental on the outskirts of town. His work kept him busy, and with each passing day, the weight on his chest grew lighter. He was healing, slowly but surely. One evening, as he drove past the old neighborhood, a familiar sight caught his eye. A for sale sign stood in the front yard of the house he had once called home. Julia was leaving. A strange sense of satisfaction settled over him. It wasn't revenge he had wanted, just justice. And in the end, karma had done its job. He parked his truck across the street and watched from a distance. Julia stepped onto the porch, looking around as if hoping for some kind of redemption, some miracle that would undo everything. But there were no miracles for people like her. Mark rolled down the window just enough for his voice to carry. When you plot against someone, Julia, make sure they're not smarter than you. She turned sharply, eyes widening as she spotted him. But before she could speak, before she could offer another excuse or plead for something she no longer deserved, he drove away. And he never looked back.